Welcome back. All right, so what we have on the board here is every Stanley Cup champion from 2006 through until this year, 2024. The reason being that I've talked lately about rebuilds, I've talked about, how teams are put together, and I've seen comments along the lines of, hey, I don't want to watch my team lose every year in the first round. They're out all the time in early rounds. Go ahead and tear it down and rebuild it. Which, I mean, sure, but I wanted to look at the previous Stanley Cup champions because that means there's a formula. That means there is a tried and true formula that teams follow, and a Stanley Cup is at the end. Or else, we're all just kind of guessing. And so let's go ahead and take a look. The ones that I've included are during the salary cap era. I feel like before the salary cap era is different than during the salary cap era. The salary cap is designed to not necessarily punish the successful teams, but punish is the right word. So in 2006, the first year we had a salary cap, we had a baffling final in that it was Carolina and Edmonton. No one saw that coming. It was highly entertaining. And so, yeah, it was that. They got there by beating Montreal in the first round 4-2. They beat New Jersey 4-1, Buffalo 4-3, and then they beat Edmonton in the final in 7 games where there was no controversy. None. Zero. Their coach was Peter Laviolette. Their leading scorer during that playoff run, Eric Staal, 25 games, 9 goals, 19 assists, 28 points. Staal had a ridiculous year in 05-06 and capped it off with a Stanley Cup win. Now, they'd missed the previous 2 Stanley Cup finals, and prior to that, they were a finalist in 2002. Doesn't really count to me personally as a rebuild. They didn't have a number 1 draft pick. They didn't stockpile draft picks or anything like that. They were only outside the playoffs for a couple years after they made the final. And even that 02 final was considered to be kind of a surprise. So for Carolina fans, maybe the problem right now is we're expecting them to be good. Maybe it has to be a surprise. The only way I can discuss it. They missed the playoffs in 2007. So they win the Stanley Cup, and then they're out of the playoffs the following year. They get back in 09. They go all the way to the conference final in 09, and then they had a decade of darkness before things are figured out and they get Rod Brind'Amour as coach. So for Carolina, it was lightning in a bottle. This was a team that kind of came out of nowhere. This was a team that wasn't picked by very many at all to go very far in the playoffs, and they got it done. 2007, a bit of a different story. Anaheim, we knew how good Anaheim was. You have Rod Niedermayer, and now Scott Niedermayer. Well, Rod Niedermayer's there too, but Rob Niedermayer. At any rate, a Niedermayer named Scott was there on the blue line, and he was joined by Chris Pronger. And as soon as that happened, I had the feeling that was unfair to everybody else in the NHL. That means that for half of a game, you're dealing with Pronger. For half of a game, you're dealing with Niedermayer. And if they need help late in the game, they can put both on the ice at the same time. So they get through Minnesota 4-1. They get through Vancouver 4-1. Detroit 4-2. And Ottawa 4-1. They were never pushed to an elimination at all in those playoffs. They're coached by Randy Carlyle and Ryan Getzlaf, their leading scorer, 21 games, 7 goals, 10 assists, 17 points. 2006, they were in the conference final, and in 2003, they were in the Stanley Cup final. I believe in 04, they missed the playoffs. So some success before they won the Stanley Cup. Again, not a huge surprise, unlike Carolina. Detroit, it's not a surprise when Detroit wins the Cup in 2008, is it? Well, the thing was that both in 02 and 08, I remember a lot of discussion of, well, they're too old. In 08, there was, well, can the young kids do it? Or, if they lost a lot of the old guard, are they still able to do it? Well, they beat Nashville in the first round in 6. They beat Colorado in 4. They beat Dallas in 6. And then they beat Pittsburgh in 6. Their coach, Mike Babcock, their leading scorer, Henrik Zetterberg, 22 games, 13 goals, 14 assists, 27 points. Detroit last missed the playoffs prior to 2008 in 1990. Detroit had been a playoff regular. And not only that, there were plenty of times between 1991 and 2008 where they got eliminated in early rounds. There were plenty of times that it was said that they choked in the playoffs. There was discussion of whether or not they would ever win, and then they did in 97. And after that, they made it look relatively easy. They won in 98, they won in 2002, they won in 2008. It's not a dynasty by dynasty terms, but it's in that dynasty region. It's in the vicinity, in the neighborhood of a dynasty. So for the Detroit Red Wings, that's their most recent Stanley Cup. There's been a lot of pain over the last decade with Detroit, and that's part of it. Part of it is that you're mortgaging your future a lot to stay in contention, and you end up with a team that's not very good for some period of time. Pittsburgh, they've got 3 Stanley Cup wins, so I had to do this one different. 2009, 2016, and 2017 for the Pittsburgh Penguins. Dan Bilesma was the coach in 2009. In 2016 and 2017, it was Mike Sullivan, who is still the coach now. 2009, they get there by beating Philadelphia in the first round 4-2. They beat Washington 4-3. Carolina, 4 straight. Detroit, 4-3. So it wasn't easy, but they get there and they have that rematch with Detroit and they win that year, which was fun. 2016, they beat the Rangers in the first round, 4-1. They beat Washington 4-2. Tampa Bay 4-3. And in the final, they beat San Jose 4-2. 2017, so back-to-back Stanley Cups. They beat Columbus 4-1, Washington 4-3, Ottawa 4-3, and Nashville 4-2. In 2009, Evgeny Malkin's their leading scorer. 24 games, 14 goals, 22 assists, 36 points. Phil Kessel, the leading scorer in 2016, 24 games, 10 goals, 12 assists, 22 points. And during the 2017 run to the Stanley Cup, Malkin's their leading scorer again, 25 games, 10 goals, 18 assists, 28 points. It is noteworthy. Crosby's not the leading scorer, but that's not Crosby's game all the time. Crosby's game is the leadership game and the two-way game as well. So Malkin gets, I believe Malkin had the Conn Smythe in 2009 and Crosby had it in 16 and 17. Although there were plenty, myself included, that thought it would have been nice to see Phil Kessel get the Conn Smythe that year. Now, they did miss the playoffs from 2001, 2002 through 2005, 2006. And they get cited a lot as, my team's gonna go on a rebuild. One thing that Pittsburgh has going for them with this run they've been on, and understanding the last couple of years they've missed the playoffs, they get Malkin and Crosby in back-to-back years in the draft. But they were also smart with the draft. They picked up other guys too in other rounds, like Letang. They get Fleury first overall, and they were just smart. They added veterans at the right time. They added the right veterans at the right time. And so it's not as easy as, well, if my team just goes ahead and tanks like Pittsburgh did. Pittsburgh never tore everything down. Guys left, but they didn't really tear everything down. This thing that GMs do now, I don't know how much longer GMs are going to be doing that. But yeah, that's 3 Stanley Cup. And I say that because I think that these extended periods of time that teams are looking to be missing the playoffs is not going to appeal to owners. Owners are going to be like, I don't want to spend the next 7 years outside the playoffs just hoping we get the next Sidney Crosby, hoping we get the next Connor Bedard. So Chicago, 2010, 2013, and 2015. So we get another team that's won 3 Stanley Cups. And Joel Quenneville, of course, the coach throughout. 2010, they beat Nashville in the first round 4-2. They beat Vancouver 4-2 in the next round. San Jose, they sweep them 4 straight. And then they beat Philadelphia in the final 4-2. 2013, they beat Minnesota 4-1. Then they beat Detroit 4-3. LA 4-1. Boston 4-2 in the Stanley Cup final. 2015, they beat Nashville in the first round, so that matches up. And again, it's 4-2. They sweep Minnesota in the next round, 4 straight. And then they beat Anaheim 4-3. Tampa Bay 4-2. Interesting of note, in the 3 years they win the Stanley Cup, the only teams that push them to the brink, 2013 it was Detroit, 2015 it's Anaheim. So those were their toughest challenges, the years they won the Stanley Cup. Outside of that, not that difficult a road for a Chicago team that is led by Jonathan Toews that first year of 2010. 22 games, 7 goals, 22 assists, 29 points. Patrick Kane led them in the subsequent years. 2013, 23 games, 9 goals, 10 assists for 19 points. And 2015, 23 games, 11 goals, 12 assists for 23 points. They did miss the playoffs from 2002, 2003 through 2007, 2008. But if you look back, and if you decide to look back into the books back in the late 90s, the Chicago Blackhawks were missing the playoffs because they were managed badly. They were drafting badly and they were trading badly. And just a little bit of everything. So once they got competent management and they were drafting better, suddenly you have 3 Stanley Cups. Now it does help that you get that number 1 draft pick of Patrick Kane. But again, if you don't surround him with the right players, it doesn't matter. 2011 is Boston's year, and nobody saw Boston coming. Nobody saw that coming. They beat Montreal in the first round 4-3. I say that because as a Boston fan, I didn't see it coming. Then they beat Philadelphia 4 straight. They beat Tampa Bay 4-3 and Vancouver 4-3, famously or infamously, depending on how you look at it, because of what happened after Game 7. Claude Julien is the coach of the Boston Bruins that year. David Krejci led them in scoring in the playoffs, 25 games, 12 goals, 11 assists, 23 points. It was really scoring by committee by Boston, and it was a team effort. And this was after they had early exits 3 prior seasons. And it's not long after they missed these playoffs that they end up going into kind of a little bit of a retool themselves, because they kind of had to. They weren't a playoff team for a couple of years there, and so they had to do what they could to get back into it. And they did well, but they've never really gone through what I would consider to be a rebuild. I feel like they're knocking on that door right now, and that Stanley Cup was 13 years ago. LA, 2012 and 2014. So they're coached by Daryl Sutter. They beat Vancouver in 2012 in that first round 4-1, which got a lot of laughter because Vancouver had won the President's Trophy. The laughter died down when they then swept St. Louis in the next round, and then they beat Phoenix 4-1 in the conference final before beating New Jersey 4-2 in the Stanley Cup final, ruining the good story that would have been a final Stanley Cup for Marty Brodeur. 2014, they beat San Jose in the first round 4-3. Then they beat Anaheim 4-3. They beat Chicago 4-3, and the Rangers 4-1. Very different storylines with those two LA teams. The first one, Jonathan Quick drags them there. Absolutely. 2012, it's all Jonathan Quick. 2014, it's more of a team effort, and it's an ability to raise your game in Game 7. I believe Justin Williams was part of that. So their leading scorer in 2012, Dustin Brown and Anze Kopitar actually tie for the lead. 20 games, 8 goals, 12 assists, 20 points. 2014, Kopitar's the leading scorer in 26 games, 5 goals, 21 assists for 26 points. They did miss the playoffs from 2002-2003 through 2008-2009. They also had 2 early exits before that Stanley Cup win in 2012, which again, no one saw coming. They were the number 8 seed. They won less than half of their NHL games during the regular season that year, and then they won the Stanley Cup. Getting hot at the right time, you can't prepare for that, really. And it is a storyline here, getting hot at the right time with LA, and I'll come back and we can discuss. But again, the LA Kings went through a rebuild. Absolutely, yes, they did, but they weren't just relying on number 1 draft picks. Kopitar was not a number 1 draft pick. Doughty was not a number 1 draft pick. High draft pick, yes, but this was a team that was also built very well. So we get to 2018, because a lot of these over here have covered all the other in-between years. So 2018, the Washington Capitals finally win their first Stanley Cup. They beat Columbus in the first round 4-2, a series which looked like it might have been Columbus's, and then it switched. Pittsburgh, they beat Pittsburgh 4-2, which was absolutely miraculous because Pittsburgh had owned them for a while. They beat Tampa Bay 4-3, and then they beat Vegas 4-1 in that Stanley Cup final. And then, they're coached by Barry Trotz. Barry Trotz had left Nashville and automatically has a lot of success with Washington. Kuznetsov, the leading scorer, and I honestly thought you could have made an argument for the Conn Smythe for Evgeny Kuznetsov. 24 games, 12 goals, 20 assists, 32 points. He was remarkable for that run. They had early exits in 9 of the previous 10 seasons, and they missed the Stanley Cup playoffs in that other season. They had not been in the conference final for a long time. So the idea that, if you're losing in back-to-back years, they've lost in the first round, second round, just rebuild. To me, it's short-sighted, and to me, the Capitals are a reason why I think that ends up being kind of short-sighted. The Capitals, year after year after year, were in the first round, gone, second round, gone, couldn't get past that. There were all the jokes with Ovechkin and not getting past round 2, and then he wins the Stanley Cup in 2018. Now, it's interesting and worthy of note that they have not been past the first round since the win in 2018, but I think Caps fans are okay with that. I think if I said, look, I'll take away your Stanley Cup ring, but you'll have made the conference finals in, say, 2020 and 2022, I think they would say no. I think they'd want that Stanley Cup ring to stay. 2019, St. Louis finally wins their first Stanley Cup. Again, did anybody see that coming? No. They beat Winnipeg in the first round 4-2. They beat Dallas in the second round 4-3. San Jose in the next round 4-2. And then Boston in the Stanley Cup final 4-3. They were underdogs in every one of those series. I think the San Jose one, they might have been favorites, but they were underdogs everywhere else. And they proved people wrong. And, of course, famously, they were last in the league, yada, yada, yada. But were they the worst team in the league? No, they were never the worst team in the league. They're coached by Craig Berube, who takes over mid-season. And he's not the only one that took over mid-season and won a Stanley Cup. There's other coaches that did as well. O'Reilly, the leading scorer for St. Louis, 26 games, 8 goals, 15 assists, 23 points. They had missed the playoffs the previous year, and they had early exits in 5 of the previous 6 seasons, a conference final being that 6th occasion there in the previous 6 years. So not a lot to speak of for St. Louis in terms of success, right? And then a Stanley Cup. It happens. So Washington and St. Louis are recent examples of teams where a GM could have said, you know what, we're going to start something different. This isn't working, and they really didn't. Did they make changes to become Stanley Cup champions? Yes, but did they ever just decide to just sell every? No, never happened. Tampa Bay, 2020 and 2021. Interesting, since 2019 they were the butt of all the jokes, and then they got their revenge. Now I know people are, it's bubble, it doesn't count. Counted for those players. So John Cooper's the coach. In 2020, they beat Columbus 4-1. They beat Boston 4-1. The Islanders 4-2, and Dallas 4-2. They were never pushed to an elimination game. 2021, they beat Florida 4-2, Carolina 4-1, the Islanders 4-3. So they're pushed to an elimination game, and then they beat Montreal in the final 4-1. Tampa Bay Lightning, of course, famously lost in 2019 after putting together a ridiculous season, and then they made up for it the following 2 years. Kucherov leads them in scoring both of their Stanley Cup winning years. 25 games, 7 goals, 27 assists, 34 points in 2020. In 2021, 23 games, 8 goals, 24 assists, 32 points. Tampa Bay played a ton of hockey over that time period. Because of where the playoffs were structured in 2020, and then when the 2021 season got started and the playoffs were done there, it was 2 Stanley Cups, I think, in a little under 9 months for the Tampa Bay Lightning. Remarkable that they were able to do that. Now, Tampa Bay had success prior to that, too. While they missed the playoffs in 2017, they were in the conference final in 2016 and 2018. They also were in the Stanley Cup final in 2015. So this isn't just, it doesn't count, because no, they were still a very good team before that, and they finally won a couple of Stanley Cups. Colorado, 2022. So they're coached by Jared Bednar, of course. In the first round, they beat Nashville 4-0, and honestly, you probably could have called that after 3 games. Just mercy rule. St. Louis, they beat in 6 games. They then swept the Edmonton Oilers in the conference final before beating Tampa Bay 4-2, as the Lightning did go back to the final after winning 2 straight Stanley Cups. The first team to be in 3 straight Stanley Cups in a very long time. So the early exits are a thing for Colorado. The previous 4 years, Colorado couldn't get past the second round. I think it was first round, second round, first round, second round in terms of their eliminations before they win that Stanley Cup in 2022. And there were questions about McKinnon, questions about whether or not they had a goaltender that was good enough, questions about whether or not they had the heart and the desire, and whether or not they were tough enough for playoff hockey, which is thrown around so much that it doesn't mean anything anymore. Anytime I hear somebody go, I don't think they're tough enough for playoff hockey, my eyes glass over and I think about puppies. So, honestly, they missed the playoffs 3 years. Then they are in the playoffs and lose in the early rounds 4 straight years. And then they win that Stanley Cup. So again, much like St. Louis and Washington, while Colorado may have been seen as more of a threat than either Washington or St. Louis, they also didn't have the playoff success. So there were plenty who could say, no, the playoff success isn't there. Then you get to Vegas, 2023. Coached by Bruce Cassidy. They beat Winnipeg in the first round 4-1. They beat Edmonton 4-2 in the second round. Then they beat Dallas 4-2 in the conference final before beating Florida 4-1 in the final. They were not pushed to an elimination game by anybody, and it was a fun run for Jack Eichel. He leads them in scoring 22 games, 6 goals, 20 assists, 26 points. And there'd always been this talk in Buffalo, you'll never win with Eichel. Eichel's not a winner. Eichel's the problem. They got to get rid of Eichel. So Eichel goes to Vegas, wins the Stanley Cup. And so, yeah, that happened. And not only that, but it's not like he's a passenger. He's their leading scorer. So for Vegas, they'd had success. 2018, their first year in the NHL, they go all the way to the final. 2020, they go to the conference final. In 2021, they go to the semifinal. To me, Vegas is an example of a team that's managed very well. And while we have been aghast at some of the personnel decisions they've made, like just, Marc-Andre Fleury was gone, Pacioretty gone for nothing, and the fact that they're willing to just ditch guys because somebody else comes along that they want more, it's honestly worked out in their favor. And so this does seem to be a formula where you should be able to remain in contention. You should be able to remain a playoff team with the right roster decisions. With the right moves, you can do that. So this season that we just had, that just finished in June, the Florida Panthers, your 2024 Stanley Cup champions, the first Stanley Cup for them, much like Vegas got their first, St. Louis, Washington their first, Anaheim, that was their first, Carolina their first. Getting that second Stanley Cup is very often more difficult. And I say that knowing that the Kings got theirs a couple years later, but for Pittsburgh, it wasn't the franchise's first cup. Definitely not Chicago's first. It wasn't Tampa's first either. So there's definitely a winning mindset with those organizations that we'd seen over the years. And I do think that makes a difference when it comes to where players sign and all that. But that's a whole other discussion for another time. So in that run, Florida beats Tampa Bay in the first round 4-1. They beat Boston 4-2. The Rangers 4-2, and Edmonton 4-3. Feels like teams I root for lose to the Stanley Cup champions a lot. At any rate, Barkov, the leading scorer for Florida in the playoffs, 24 games, 8 goals, 14 assists, 22 points. The reigning leader in terms of being seen as the most underrated player in the league, even though everybody thinks he's great. Anyways, 2023, they were in the final, of course, against Vegas. They had 3 previous early exits. In fact, I remember in 2020 thinking, why? Like, they lost against the Islanders in the qualifying round, and I was just very dejected watching that. I thought, I've rooted for Florida to do something in the playoffs for a long time. Maybe it's just never going to happen, was my thought process in 2020. And then they win the Stanley Cup in 2024. But they missed 6 playoffs of the previous 7 before that, and it's not because they had some grand plan. They were just managed really badly. And then you get a good manager in there. He's bringing in guys that end up leading them to a Stanley Cup in 2024, who may have been drafted highly, not necessarily by Florida. And it's a really well-built team. So Florida's in a position where they could win again. And they didn't, again, they never really did I understand people are going to say, well, they were in a rebuild. No, they were just bad. I always felt like Florida was just bad. They didn't have management that knew what they were doing, and then they got management that knew what he was doing, and suddenly things got a lot better for fans in Florida. So before I wrap this up, I want to talk about droughts. I want to talk about Stanley Cup final droughts. And of course, for Toronto, they're most famous because it's 1967. I understand all the mockery and jokes and all that people do. I'm not going to do that here because, no. But 1967 has been a long time. Now, Toronto's a team that's been out in the first or second round every single year for a long time. But I don't think that necessarily tearing things down would be an answer. I think figuring out how to make this a Stanley Cup champion is better, like what Washington did. I mean, if Toronto wants a team to look up to, why not the Capitals? Capitals were out in the first or second round many, many times, and then they just put it together and figured it out. The Arizona Coyotes magnets on the board because they technically got the Winnipeg Jets history. So going back to 1980, it was just no. And Utah's not saddled with that history because it didn't travel with Arizona. So you're welcome, Utah. The Islanders, no Stanley Cup Finals since 1984. So it's been a long, long time for them looking for that formula. The Buffalo Sabres, 1999. And we know that the Stanley Cup playoffs are a dream of the Buffalo Sabres fandom. They haven't seen those since 2011. The Winnipeg Jets, formerly the Atlanta Thrashers. So looking back to Thrashers history, there hasn't been a Stanley Cup final for that franchise in their existence. So since 2000, the first playoffs the Thrashers could have made, there's been no Stanley Cup for that organization or even a final. 2001 is the date for both Columbus and Minnesota because their first seasons were 2000-2001. And there's been no Stanley Cup final for either of them. Calgary, 2004. Since then, it's been a tough ride for them when it comes to the playoffs. Unless they play Vancouver. And then 2006, Carolina. So Carolina wins that Stanley Cup. They haven't been back to the final since. They have struggled to get through conference finals since then. And this past year, they were out in the second round. And there's a lot of discussion about Carolina and how they're not going to win and they're not built to win. And it feels very similar to some of the other teams on this board who then figured out how to win. So this is why I don't think there's one formula to create a Stanley Cup champion. I don't think there's a proven formula that anybody can go, okay. For instance, if you take... I'm trying to think of which GM I would look at from any of these teams and say, okay, so put him there. Okay, so like Steve Yzerman in Tampa, he goes to Detroit. It's not easy. It doesn't mean that necessarily Detroit's winning a Stanley Cup. If Joe Sakic ever decided to leave Colorado and go to Toronto, does that make Toronto a Stanley Cup champion? No. Does a GM leaving Toronto going somewhere else mean that team's never going to win the Stanley Cup? And I know what Pittsburgh fans are going to say, but I'm telling you, that's not necessarily how things work. So at some point, I'm going to do a video on coaches that have won Stanley Cups. I'll do a video as well on GMs who've won Stanley Cups, because I don't think there's a formula, and yet we get sold on this idea of, well, we're going to build to something here. And the example I always think of, and I mentioned this last night when I was talking to my wife about the idea of setting up a board like this, I remember Eugene Melnyk and Pierre Dorion and their steadfast belief that the Ottawa Senators were going to have unbridled success. And I believe that unbridled success was supposed to start in 2021, 2022. And that the idea was, hey, we're going to build up and be Stanley Cup champions. We've got all these young kids. Well, they still have all those young kids. Those young kids are paid very well. They still have not been able to make it into the playoffs. There is no guaranteed formula. So this is why I get kind of, frustrated a bit when I see people all the time like, this team just should just rebuild. And I've said it myself. I have. But it's not that simple. I think the smarter way to go about it is that, yes, you sell off players that are on expiring contracts when your team's not going to make the playoffs, and then you try to figure out the smart way forward. And it doesn't necessarily involve a rebuild. It doesn't mean you have to sell off all your veterans, but maybe you sell off a couple. And I'll come back to Tampa for a moment here. I think what we're seeing this year with Tampa is a litmus test. They let Stamkos go, the face of the franchise, the captain of the franchise, and brought in Jake Guentzel. Jake Guentzel is a lot younger. Well, I think he's 5 years younger than Stamkos, 5 or 6 years younger than Stamkos. A lot, just when I said it, I was like, is it a lot? But he is younger, and so he'll be in his prime longer. You think he's going to be playing longer? Are we going to see teams maybe do that a little more? Maybe you let that veteran who's in his early 30s go. No matter how attached the fan base is, no matter how attached he is to the city, you let him go in order to free up that money so that money can go to a younger player, and maybe it keeps that window for a Stanley Cup, that door for a Stanley Cup, whichever opening you figure a team needs to climb through in order to win a Stanley Cup, maybe it keeps it open a little bit longer. Maybe teams are starting to follow the Vegas formula. If you look at Florida's formula, I still think it's pretty simple. They look at assets on other teams, they get them for pennies on the dollar, and then when those assets mature, they let them go elsewhere for a lot of money, and then they find more players they can get for pennies on the dollar, which again, I think Vegas has done pretty well too. So I think that might be the smartest way to go about things now in today's National Hockey League with the salary cap. But let me know your thoughts. Do you think, no, full-on rebuild's the way to go? Because the most recent team that kind of went in that direction, I would say, would be 2017 when the Penguins won. Since then, it's hard to find a team that I say, oh yeah, there was a full-on rebuild that led to that Stanley Cup. I'm not saying there wasn't a rebuild at some point, but is that what created a Stanley Cup champion? And that's where it gets a little more difficult to dissect. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe in the event you may not have done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support as always. I will talk to you again soon.